I'm going to talk to you about nitrogen deposition, which is a pollutant that perhaps some of you are less aware of. We tend to think of nitrogen as generally a good thing for plants, but just like anything, too much of a good thing is not always quite so good. And this is a figure from a paper that was published by Rockstrom in Science a few years ago, and it shows our planetary boundaries. And if we look at nitrogen deposition, we can see that we're really exceeding our planetary boundary on nitrogen deposition. So we've changed the nitrogen cycle to such an extent that its potential to cause problems in our planet globally is really, really apparent. And actually having a bigger effect at the moment than climate change, which is where we see perhaps a lot more ecosystems research going on. Now, nitrogen pollution comes from a number of sources. There are two main forms, oxidized nitrogen and reduced nitrogen. The oxidized nitrogen comes predominantly from burning of fossil fuels, so vehicle exhausts, power generation, industrial processes. Reduced nitrogen, on the other hand, comes predominantly from agricultural sources. A lot of it is from fertilizers, volatilization of animal waste, particularly where manure is stored badly, and biomass burning, producing both reduced and oxidized nitrogen. So we have a wide range of sources, and with our increased burning of fossil fuel over the last couple of hundred years, it's really increased. And of course, with the Haber-Bosch process and development of inorganic fertilizers, our increased use of those, we're seeing increases in nitrogen deposition across the developed world. If we look at our global nitrogen budget, this is kilotons of nitrogen emitted, and the numbers in black are the totals, and the numbers in red are the anthropogenic component of that. And you can see nitrogen oxides are almost exclusively emitted by anthropogenic processes. Then we have other sources with biomass burning, soils and agriculture, of which the anthropogenic component is reasonably large in all cases. And then ocean sources, which are much more driven by natural processes. And all that nitrogen goes up into the atmosphere and it has to come down again. It has to be returned to the land somehow, and that's as wet and dry deposition, so either in rain or as dust that's then washed through into the soil. And we can't add all this extra nitrogen into our natural communities without having some effect upon them. And those processes are driven by processes that are occurring in the soils. So we see acidification of the soils. Nitrogen oxides dissolved in rain forms an acid. So we have a direct deposition of an acid. But also you have all those processes going on, the conversion of nitrogen, the plant uptake of nitrogen. It all produces an acidifying effect on the soils. So acidification is a major driver of the changes. The other driver, of course, is eutrophication, that enrichment of the soil that then has impacts for the plant communities. And at very high concentrations, we can see a direct toxicity, but that would only tend to be when you're immediately adjacent to a point source. So, for example, right next to a chicken farm, a large chicken unit that perhaps has inadequate ventilation, we might see some direct toxicity effects on the plants. But generally, in the broader environment, these effects are mainly driven by acidification and eutrophication. And the effects are very real. This is a survey that we conducted across the western zone of Europe, the Atlantic biogeographic zone. And we used a standardized method within a single plant community, an acid grassland community. It would typically be a grassland that's used for extensive pasture, so it's grazed but at low intensities. And we see very clear declines in species richness along that gradient. We also measured a whole range of other factors that might affect the species composition and species richness at these sites to isolate that effect of nitrogen deposition. And it's very clear. We see that decline. And what's important is that actually that decline is a slight slope. It's a slight curve. So at the lower end, you actually have systems that are more sensitive to nitrogen deposition than at the higher end because you've lost those species that are particularly sensitive. And it's not just in acid grasslands that we see this. This is data that comes from a large multi-habitat survey conducted across the UK. And we see very similar trends in bog communities, upland heath communities, lowland heath, and sand dunes. So all of those communities, we're seeing this loss of species richness. And we can start to break this down and look at which species it is that we're losing. It's not always consistent, and of course across different communities, individual species may respond very differently, because this is due to competitive interactions rather than this species dies because nitrogen's added. It's much more complicated than that. But one of the larger scale studies that we've done is taking volunteer collected data. So this is data from the Vascular plant database, BSBI data, so large scale national data on the presence of individual species. And within that, we developed models to look at the probability of finding an individual species at a given location. And so we were able to look at the relationships between the probability of finding a plant and its total and levels of total nitrogen deposition across the country. And again, we removed other effects that were likely to be there. So land use intensity, it's all filtered for habitat, we've taken out climate drivers, everything like that, so that what we're left with is hopefully an effect of nitrogen deposition. We also take sulfur deposition away from there because although that's declined a lot in recent years, it has a very large historic acidifying effect. So I've just picked out two examples here from calcareous and acid grassland, Onionis repens and Vicia lateroides. Of course, both of these are leguminous species, and we think that as nitrogen levels increase, basically they're losing their competitive advantage and potentially forming less associations. But we haven't investigated the physiology of why this is changing at all. Now, we've also taken this to a larger scale to look at what the global patterns are. And these are sites that are part of the nutrient network, which is a global experiment. It's a small-scale experiment that is replicated in, I think we now have over 70 sites across the world. Simple NPK nutrient addition and grazing exposure. And the sites are all over. So I've got examples here from the Tibetan Plateau up in the top corner. This one's Australia, and some from the US, from the north, and then a more desert environment. And in the middle, my site in Lancashire, which seems a whole lot less glamorous than ones. I mean, we have them in South Africa, and they have problems with elephants knocking down their grazing exclosures and things, which just doesn't happen in Lancashire. So these are some of the nutrient network sites that we used in this analysis. And we were particularly interested in the relationship between productivity and nitrogen deposition, because productivity is one of the main drivers behind a eutrophication response. So it's what drives that competitive interaction. And we were quite startled, really, to see the magnitude of the effect. So this graph shows a standardized effect size. So at 0 in the middle, you have no effect. And then the further that the bar moves from 0, the bigger the effect that we're having. And we looked at traditionally large drivers of a productivity response. And we were really surprised to see that actually nitrogen deposition, even at this global scale where we only have quite coarse models, is actually one of the bigger drivers of productivity within these semi-natural grassland systems. Now, I've talked a lot about the above ground responses, but actually those below ground responses are what are driving this. And I mentioned acidification as a very important driver, and this is data from a gradient in the UK. And you can see that pH in this top graph here is a very important driver. So as as nitrogen deposition is increasing, soil pH is decreasing. And those changes in pH have important implications then within the soil for the availability of other nutrients and of metals. And one of the things we think may be quite an important driver, and there's some evidence from individual species to support this, is the availability of aluminium within the soil and aluminium toxicity. And we can see here that as the pH goes down, as we would expect, the availability of aluminium is increasing. But it's not just this. We see big changes in species' abilities to compete. And this is just looking at individual species and their allocation to above and below ground biomass. And you can see that that changes with the amount of nitrogen that you put on and the form of nitrogen that you put on. Individual species react differently. Within a community where you have 20, 30, 40 species, those interactions then become very complex. And even with the 3 species that we were looking at here, the models became very, very difficult to interpret. Within a community, we're facing a huge challenge in trying to understand exactly what's going on. And so that's something that we're still working on, as well as particularly looking at how this might be impacting on carbon cycling, given our large changes in biomass. So, in conclusion, nitrogen deposition is having quite a large negative effect on semi-natural vegetation communities, and with good reason to believe that this is happening worldwide. Not only is there evidence that I presented here, but we've also got a lot of evidence from experimental manipulations showing that changes in invasive species occurrence, and again, something that we're currently working on. But we really need to start quantifying the impacts on habitats of conservation interest and investigate how we can promote recovery from this nitrogen deposition, how we can mitigate its effects, but most of all, we need to start looking at further reductions in emissions. So, thank you very much.